Hey everyone, hi. Welcome to this webinar. Thanks for taking out time on a weekend, right? Hopefully, you're able to get some sort of a value out of this. And secondly, like before starting, I just hope everybody's doing well and like given the current situation. If not, let's just remember that we'll get through this. Having said that, let's get started. So one of the even though I'm going to be talking about what is the process of writing an effective PRD, and we'll talk a lot about product requirements documents, which is what a PRD is. One of my other aims is that also, hopefully, as we talk more and more about PRDs, you will also get a sense of what is the job that a PM does. And I'm hoping that through this conversation around PRDs, I'm able to shed some light on that aspect as well. So do let me know if if you're able to not understand, like if that doesn't come out. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well. But one of my aims is to make sure you also understand what goes into a day-to-day life of a product manager, because PRDs are pretty central to what you do as a product manager, right? So having said that, let's get started. So Ankit's already done a good introduction for me, so I'm not going to repeat most of it. I just want to add one point that currently, like, I take care of like the overall platform complexity at Haptik. So if you have any questions regarding how to make something more usable, UX related questions, you can always ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I'm happy to answer those. Those are the kind of areas that I expertise in, which is like how can you make something easier to use? How do you make a platform more self-serve? Those sort of That's kind of the niche I work in. So that's a little bit about me. I'm not going to repeat the other backgrounds. Gets already mentioned that. Cool. So let's dive into the details, right? Like, what is a PRD? Like, what does a PRD even mean? Like, and why should we really care about it? So first things first, a PRD stands for Product Requirements Document. I'm pretty sure all of you already probably know that. Uh, but what you probably don't know is that writing a PRD is one of the most crucial parts of a product manager's job, right? Like this is the most central job that you do. Like this is the equivalent of writing code for an engineer. Uh, so this is one of the most crucial parts, and the reason it's one of the most crucial parts is the product requirements document that you write, the PRD that you write. It is the central document which is used in the entire development process of a product. So this is like the basic. This is a single source of truth that everybody is referring to throughout the process, right? Like your engineers are referring to this, your designers are referring to this, your like the other stakeholders in your company, maybe your leadership team and your executive team is also referring to this to understand what's happening. And like so, this is the central document that everybody in the company is referring to understand what's happening, and that's why it's very crucial that you get this aspect right. Based on the company you are in, like some companies do try to avoid the term PRD. Like there's some negative connotation around it because PRDs come from a very old style of working where you first describe the entire feature and like you do it, which is really what is called a waterfall model. Today companies tend to be more agile, which is like, hey, can we ship something quickly? Can we get feedback quickly? So there's some negative connotations around the term PRD, but they will need some sort of a product spec documentation, right? Like you still need to have some sort of a documentation around what you're building, why you're building, and those sort of things. So even though you don't call it, you might like your company might not call it a PRD, you're still writing a product spec, and whatever we learn today will be useful for writing a product spec. Like you don't have to call it a PRD. And finally, I already mentioned it, but multiple teams in the organization will be referring to this, like different, like your marketing team, your sales team, your design, engineering, everybody's going to be referring to this one piece of document. So it is highly crucial that you get this right. So I also want to get into like how do different, like we've been saying, okay, different teams use a PRD, it's a central thing. So let's just look at how do different teams even use a PRD and why do they need it. So the first team obviously is a product management team. The reason it's useful for you use for the product team itself is like because you want to have a clear understanding of what you're building, what is the feature you're building, what are the benefits of it, what are the objectives of it, how will you track metrics, what metrics will you track, is it successful or not. All of these things are very critical, and this is what the product management team itself will use the PRD for. But apart from that, there's also the product marketing, or like based on the company you're in, there might be evangelism sort of a team. Like essentially think of this as marketing teams, right? So a PRD is also important for the marketing team because like they need to understand the feature that is being built so that they can market it well. Like if they like otherwise you'll end up spending a lot of time trying to get on calls with marketing people, trying to explain them the feature. But if you do a good PRD, you won half the battle because you can get them early on in the process. You can say, hey, this is the feature I'm trying to build. Can you start putting some marketing timelines around this? And get them early on into the process and start asking them questions. Okay, how do you think we can market this? How do you think we should market this? Get your marketing team involved as early as possible and make sure they also go through your PRD, which is where it becomes very critical, right? Finally, your engineering team also needs this because they'll follow this as the blueprint to build out whatever feature is there. So they need to understand what is the problem, what is the solution that's being provided, and have proper specifications around it so they can actually build out the solution. I'm not mentioned it here, but apart from engineering, even your design teams will be referring to this document to come up with the right designs, because they need to understand what the goals of the feature are, right? Like, are we trying to make it more usable? Are we trying to add a new feature? What is the goal? So they can use that context in their mind when they're coming up with new designs. Your sales and pre-sales sort of teams will also need this, because if they have clarity on the benefits of the solution, let's say you're making something which will make the product faster by 30 times or something, right? So now they know that, hey, there's a feature which will make my product 30 times faster. So they can start communicating with, like, again, sales and pre-sales is more for B2B sort of companies, where like there's active sales happening, where your sales folks are going and selling the software. So in those cases, if they have a clear idea of what's coming up, what the new solutions coming up, they can go to the market and start selling it, or like start evangelizing and start talking about it. And also they can bring you feedback back to you, right? Which is, they can be like, hey, we need to get this out early, or like this part of this feature does not make sense. So you want to make sure all the different teams are involved, and that is where PRD acts as like the central collaborating document for all of it. So now that we understand what a PRD is, before we step into the solution, let's look at why is it hard to write a PRD. If you know the problem and solution, it be very straightforward. But like Ankit mentioned, the challenge is not writing the PRD itself. Like, I'm pretty sure as a PM, once you've done enough research and you understand it, you can very easily write a spec documentation. You can write a 20-page document on what you're trying to do. But the biggest challenge always when writing a PRD is how detailed should it be? Because the problem is, because different teams are looking at this PRD and they care about different aspects, right? Like a marketing team will care more about, okay, what is the solution? How can I market this? What is the timelines? Versus the engineering team will not care so much probably about something else, right? The engineering team will care more about the detailed flows and key features that need to be built and the engineering aspects of it. So because there's different teams and different aspects, and they care about different aspects, and also they have very different sort of contexts that are coming in with. Like a marketing team doesn't really understand, okay, the solution is okay, whatever it is, but I need to understand, okay, what are the benefits out of this? What are the goals and stuff? So you want to make sure like everybody is able to gain value out of this document. So if you write a 20-page document, like if you make it too detailed and go step by step and explain everything, a lot of people might not even read it. They might just skip it. They might not read it. They might not get the most value out of it unless you like really force them to read through it. And this hampers you, because if they're not reading it, they're not giving you feedback. And as a PM, you want to get as much feedback early on in the process, so you don't over invest into something. So that's a problem if you can make it too detailed. On the other hand, if you keep it too vague, which is like if you don't add enough details into it and make it very abstract, people will be like, okay, on abstract it makes sense. Like for example, if you just write, okay, we are going to make the screen better. Like we're going to make the screen better. Everybody's going to be like, okay, I make the screen better. What? Like I don't know what that means, but okay, that sounds good. So you also don't want to keep it too vague, because then like people don't really have a clear idea of what you're doing, and then there's no feedback to you. And maybe after you've released it, everybody's like, oh, you meant to do this. This is not going to add value at all. So the challenge is always, what is the right amount of detail to be added so that people are getting enough value, but they're not getting bored as well. And which is why structuring your PRD into correct sections and having the right format for the PRD becomes super critical. So in the next section, we'll talk about how do you pick a format and how do you like what that format should be. And that's what we'll talk about next. But before getting into that, I know I've talked a lot, so I'm going to take a pause and like wait for a few questions.
Guys, please feel free to type in your questions, or you can raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute. Just give me a second. Feel free to ask any questions, right? So yeah, I think there was someone. Bandhavi has asked to unmute. Bandhavi, please go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. And hi, Akshay.
Hey, hi.
Hey, hi. So writing now I'm working as a business analyst, and I did come across various names or nomenclature for the same documents that we use across organizations. One such is like, design document, which actually only explains the UI UX part, functional part, basically functional part, not going much of any data sources or tech architecture part. And then there comes another document, tech architecture or tech document, and the owner for that document would be mostly a tech lead, and the functional document would be it would be the responsibility of a business analyst. So having working for almost a year and a half, and I have never come across this PRD, and have never seen a product manager or PM working on a document. So just wanted to understand why, in the first place, why are we having different names for this one common document, and and who is basically responsible for this document, and how exactly this documentation work is happening across organization, like who is being more um, responsible or taking the ownership of these documents.
Got it. Good question. So why is it different across organizations? I think it's just it's one of the curses of the product management field, that there's no sort of consistency. People have different names for the same thing. But like, if you put the name aside, right? If you look at what the goals of this document are, so you need a document which explains what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. You can call it a design document. So I think what's missing is like a design document. The way you mentioned it is, it has the flows and key features and all the details and how you, and on the solution itself. And then there's another document that you said, which was more around, sorry, what was the other document that you mentioned apart from design document?
It was tech. It was tech.
Yeah, it was tech architecture, right? Again, which is going into deeper into the solution itself.
Yeah, system design.
But what a PRD does is it brings all of this together, which is not just solution and architecture, but what is the objective of this? Like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And that is the primary responsibility of a PM, right? Like, answering the why is the biggest responsibility of a PM, which is, why are we solving this problem? Why are we even building this? What is the reason? So that should exist in some form somewhere. Maybe it's not a document, it's an email, or like it's written somewhere else, it's called something else. But at the end of the day, you need a document which explains why you're solving something, and then also a document which is how you're going to solve it. And PRD generally tend to be like an amalgamation of all this. So what you'll see in many companies is they'll have a PRD, but then there'll be a tech architecture document linked to that PRD, which is then just goes deeper into the tech aspects of it. And there'll be a design document linked to the PRD, which goes deeper into the design flows. The PRD is like the central place. And like, they might not call it a PRD, but there's always some central place where all of this is collected. It could just be a Google Sheet for all that matters, right? It could be a Google Sheet, which is a collection of all these documents.
Yeah. Okay. And usually, who is the owner for these PRDs? Like, for whatever you have come across, would it be a BA or a PM?
So in general, in most places, a PRD is always owned by a product manager. Because a product manager is responsible at the end of the day for the entire success of the feature. So they are the ones who own the end-to-end aspects of it, but not necessarily the ones who fill out every section of it.
Okay.
Kunal, you had a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Akshay. Kunal here.
Yeah.
So, Akshay, I'm working as a product manager right now, and what we follow is like writing user stories. Like, we have epics and user stories. So, I just wanted to understand, is user story a subset of a PRD? Because what happens is, for one product, there will be n number of user stories. Also, I felt that PRD, like if we write it one time for an MVP, will it keep evolving over time, or like what's the scope?
So I'll take the second question first. A PRD in general tends to be a little evolving, because you'll write your first version of PRD and you'll share it across with like the different stakeholders, and they'll come back with some feedback, and you keep changing it. So a PRD does tend to keep evolving. And the second question was like, are user stories a subset of a PRD? And the answer to that is yes. Like, a user story, essentially, like, I'm assuming you write a user story in a BRD format, right? Which is, when a user does this, something should happen, and like this value should be there.
Yeah, so we use Jira basically, where we kind of put all the stories in the backlog, and then each sprint we pick up a few stories for different features.
Correct. So then your Jira stories are essentially the solution aspects of it, which is like, how will I, like, they're talking more about the how of the feature, right? Which is, what will I do to solve this feature, which is part of a PRD. So PRD answers, like, if you really think about it, a PRD answers 4 questions, which is, why are we doing this? I'll talk a little bit about that in the next section, but I'll answer about why are
I
we doing
think
this.
that subsequent thing will answer my question.
Yeah, let's wait for the format, and I think I will answer your question.
Sure.
Nitin had a doubt. Hey, Nitin, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Akshay. Thanks for the thing. I just wanted to understand how technical should PRDs be, because I just transitioned to an APM role last week, and I come from a background. So yeah, that's my question. How technical should PRDs be?
So it really depends on the team and the product that you're building. Like if you're building a very technical product, your PRDs tend to be very technical. But what I'll say is you don't have to do it. So you need to understand, right? A PM owns the PRD, but is not the one who necessarily has to add in everything. So you can define the non-technical aspects of it and then get your engineering manager or like whoever your engineering lead is to help out with to fill out the technical details of it. But whether a PRD should have technical details or not will really depend on the company itself. Like, for example, let me give an example, right? Like, for example, if you're building a sort of, let's say, e-commerce website, then the PRD will probably not be very technical. It will just be around, okay, we're gonna start this new screen with new categories and stuff. Versus, let's say you're working at a developer tool sort of a company. Like, let's say you're working at GitHub or something like some other ML tool or something where the feature itself is very technical. So in those cases, the PRD tends to be technical. But you can leverage your engineering lead or engineering manager to fill out those details.
Got it. So just extending to what Akshay said, in my experience at Games 24x7, right, we would not write, it wouldn't be very technical, but we would write everything which is basically like how a feature would work, like the validations in it. Let's say if there is a field which you want to, there's a field which a user should enter, right? So all the validations for it, all the acceptance criteria for it, all the tech part will be taken care by the dev managers. They will write their internal, tech requirement document based on the user stories, which I will give to them. So as far as I was concerned, it was never very, it wasn't very technical. Yeah, I think I'll just unmute him once and just check. I think you can tell us if we answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Ankit and Akshay. That answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure, let's go ahead.
Cool. So now that we've talked about the importance of a PRD format, let's talk about how do you even pick a format? What is the right format to pick? So first question let's answer is like, why is a PRD format important? Like, why should you care about a PRD format? Why not just like open a Google Doc and start writing things? One thing is you want to make it structured so that different teams can get enough value out of it. And also you want to make sure across your team, everybody is using, like, let's say at your company, there's like 5 product managers, right? You also want to make sure all of you have some similar format of writing it, because then that makes other teams jobs easier. Because as a marketing person, then I don't have to refer to like 10 different kinds of PRDs and understand what's happening. And the good thing is, like, if you choose the PRD format correctly, like if you have the right sort of format, it actually helps you structure your own thoughts, because it's asking you to fill in certain sections for it, and then you're also thinking along the same line. So a good PRD format will also help you structure your thoughts the right way. Because let's be honest, right, when coming up with a feature, there's so many things to think about, which is how will you take it to market? How will you measure success for it? How will engineers build out? What will you export? How will the designs look like? There's so many aspects to it, and it's easy to get lost in those details. And having a good format will help you keep your thoughts also structured. And that's why it's important to pick a format, right? And in general, like, a format should contain all the important information, which is what is the objective, what are the UX flows and designs that are there, what are success metrics, like what does success for this feature look like, and then finally you need to have some sort of launch and timeline information around it. So what should an ideal PRD format have? Like, how do we know if the PRD format that you're looking at is a good format or is it not a good format? So the first thing you want to look for is that it's broken down into segments and sections, because like I said, right, you don't want it to be too long, but you also don't want it to be too short. So a good way to balance it out is to break it down into different sections based on value to different teams, which is can you break it into a segment where you'll be like, okay, as a marketing team, I can only look at this one section and I can get all my value. Or as an engineering person, I can look at this one section of the PRD and get my full value. So going to the previous question, which is like your tech requirements document, and all these could be one of these sections in the PRD. And then an engineering team or something can only look at that and start getting a lot of value, and they don't really have to go through the entire PRD every time. So that way you want to make sure like it's broken down into the right segments and sections. And the other important thing is you want to get a buy-in from the entire product team. Like you don't want like 5 product managers in a company to use 5 different formats. So you want to make sure all the PMs in the company have bought in and agreed to use one format. The format itself is like can change basis company to company, but you want to make sure everybody in your company is using the same format. And at Haptik, I'll tell you, right, we've built this into our tooling itself, which is we use Notion for writing PRDs. And if you can see the screenshot, we split our PRDs by quarter, saying, okay, this quarter, this is what we'll work on. And if you see, there's a add a new PRD button. And the way it works is the moment a PM goes and clicks on add a new PRD, it actually pre-fills the format for them. So PM doesn't even have to think about the format. And that's how we ensure that every PRD written at Haptik has the same format. So the advantage is anybody from the company is looking at a PRD knows what are the different sections in it, what section I need to look at, and all those aspects are cleared out. So this is what an ideal PRD format should have. But I will not leave you that. I'll give you a recommended PRD format. This is something like I've tried, I think, at least 10 to 15 different formats for my PM career. Everything from the one that Product Hunt recommends, the one that Google has. Like I try to get PRDs from my friends at Amazon and like other companies as well. And I even try to come up with my own PRD formats. But I finally found one that actually worked and it made sense because it finally clicked, I think, in my head also, okay, saying, okay, now I understand what a PRD is. And this is not a PRD template that was created by me, so I will not take credit for it at all. So this is the PRD template that is used by Figma. I've slightly modified it, but it's pretty close to the original one. So this is the PRD template that's followed by Figma, and a lot of companies started to pick up. I think Coda and a bunch of other companies, even Google probably now has started looking at these things itself. So I put a link to the PRD format of Figma, but once the slides are shared with you, you can actually look at it. But you can just Google Figma PRD template and you'll find it's pretty popular on the internet. The good thing is this template really structures the entire format. So it breaks the PRD down into 3 segments, right? Which is the first, and this will answer a lot of questions that came up in the previous section, which is the first section. It has this problem alignment. And essentially what you're trying to answer here is what is the problem you're trying to solve. So the first thing you have to define when you're writing a PRD is what is the problem you're trying to solve. And if you don't have a good enough answer for this, then there's no reason, like you shouldn't go ahead. Like you need to have a very clear understanding of what is the problem you're trying to solve. Once your problem alignment is there, the next section that you get into the PRD is solution alignment, which is, okay, we understand what the problem is. Let's look at how to solve it. And that is where solution alignment comes in. This is where your tech requirements document, your design flows, all of these things go in. And finally, once you have your problem and solution defined, finally you get into launch readiness, which is, okay, I know what my problem is. I know what my solution is. Let's set dates. Like I'll do this, like you can split into phases saying, okay, I'll do this by this date. This is my launch. This is my launch date. These are things I'll need to launch. So if you look at it, already it brings a lot of structure to the entire PRD process, which is you're going down the route of what is the problem to solve, how will you solve it, and by when will you solve it. So this is the PRD format. In the next section, we'll go deeper into each of these sections, but I do want to stop here for any questions.
Guys, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll just unmute you guys. You can ask a question. Bandhavi, you had a question?
Yeah. So Akshay, will this go for both fixed bid projects and also time and material projects? Because sometimes we wouldn't even know when we would be like, the launch or the timeline estimates, everything will be subjective to change, right? So
yeah,
does this format kind of, do you take this up for every kind of project model?
So which is why I said a PRD is sort of an evolving document, right? Like you don't have to set actual, like you don't have to set, the dates are not set in stone. Like you don't have to set something like, okay, April 28, 10 a.m. we'll release it. So your timelines can be a little vague based on the project or the feature itself. For example, you can say by end of this quarter or by end of this year, those sort of timelines are also there. But the more detail you can get into it, the better, but you can always have some abstract timelines, right? Like you can be like, okay, by next year we'll do this, or in the next 4 months we'll do this. Even bringing that sort of timeline into it helps everybody align around what it is.
Agreed.
One interesting thing what used to happen with us at Games 24/7, right? So we used to define projects as strategic projects, which would be long term, maybe 1 or 2 months they'll have a time to release, right? And the other would be tactical items, right? So even we would just write a 1 or 2 pager also for that, just to get it done with, right? So the format, I wouldn't say varied, but then for one pages it was pretty straightforward. What did we want, right? It maybe integrate with Razorpay. That might not take a whole lot of thinking to do, right? You just need to integrate it. So a one pager would work there. But then if you were to have, let's say, a slightly long-term project like leaderboard, in that you would require very detailed PRT there. I think Viraj also had a question. Go ahead, Viraj.
Hi, Akshay. Thanks for doing this. So my question was like, how important is user stories in the PRD?
So again, like different companies do it different ways, but user stories essentially tells you how a user, like at least the way, like the right way to write a user story is, it tells you how the user will interact with your platform and or what the value the user will get out of your platform. And that typically goes into solution alignment. It's important for your engineering team and it's important for your design team to understand, okay, this is like, if a user comes on my platform, this is what should happen, right? Like we'll go back to Ankit's example, which is, as a user, when I come on this form, these fields should be validated. I should have these sort of things. So it's very important that you have it, but it's more important for your engineering and design teams. And that goes into the solution alignment aspect of it, which is how will you solve it? And you're basically describing the solution in the user stories itself.
Okay. So like user stories don't go into the problem alignment, like what problem user is facing. It's going into the solution phase, like what our product, this feature is going to help.
Correct.
Or can it go in both ways? Okay, what problem?
User stories will always go into solution alignment, because a user story describes what the feature will do, right? Like, because it's essentially like a Jira ticket which engineering team will pick up and they'll implement it. So it's going more on the solution side of it. Whereas a problem statement for the form could be that people are entering wrong email IDs. That's the problem statement. And then the solution to that could be that, hey, my email field should have some sort of a validation. And that becomes a user story. Add validation on this form field, which is a user story. But the problem itself is that people are entering incorrect emails and you're not able to send, let's say, marketing material or something else to them.
Understood. Thank you.
But Akshay, to sum it up, like user stories, as far as I see, it is mostly for the development purpose, not for marketing or anybody, but PRD would be for any of the stakeholders of the project, right?
Correct. So correct. I think you summed it up perfectly. PRD is for everybody across the board to look at it, but user stories are meant for your designers or like your engineers.
Yeah, anybody developing the product.
Yeah.
Saurabh, you had a question? Kunal, do you have a question?
Hi, Akshay. So, Akshay, I just wanted to understand, like, do we define PRDs at a platform level, product level, or a individual feature level? And like, are there any specific guidelines how we can go about it?
So generally, PRDs are written at a feature level or a collection of features level, because like, again, I'll tie it back to problem, right? Like every problem you're trying to solve should have one PRD. It could be like a platform level problem, which is, I want to have a uniform sign up across all my platform. But you tie it back to the problem. Like, I keep saying this again and again, but a PRD is essentially a document which describes what problem you're trying to solve and how you're going to solve it. So I think as long as that is there.
My question was like, so suppose there is a problem, but now there are multiple use cases. So will we have a single PRD for it or separate PRDs for it?
So as long as the problem is unique, you can have a single PRD. Within solution alignment, then you can break it down into further sections.
Got it. Thank you.
Or I'll tell you one thing that we had done at Haptik, right? Like this was a very recent feature where we had to add language capabilities. And this would mean we had to do a lot of things in different tools in our platform. So we had one master PRD, which was, okay, this we want to add, like the problem was we need to add language capabilities into our things. And then we broke it down, like then solution, we wrote other problems, right? The solution was like, okay, our analytics team, like our analytics tool should start supporting language. So the analytics team then goes and writes other PRDs, which is like a subset of this PRD, which is okay to enable language on analytics. I have these 4 problems or these 5 problems, and each of those problems has its separate PRD.
Got it. Yeah.
Ankit, anything to add from your side? Okay.
No, I think that was great. Saurabh had a doubt. Saurabh?
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Ankit, and thanks, Akshay, for doing this. You may find my question a little absurd, but it comes from a real life example. Like I'm facing this issue.
Yeah.
My question is, how do you make teams read PRD? Like, for example, like when I say how do you make them read is, I'm facing this issue. Like we have made a PRD, we call it a playbook, but there are oftentimes like the developers come and ask me like this question, like when do we do this and how do we do it? Ek up karna hai, things like that. So I have a tough time actually telling them why don't you go and refer to PRD. So that culture is not there, at least in my team. Especially we come from a service background, and where like most of the things are discussed in the stand-ups, but like it gets difficult at times. So have you faced this problem? If yes, how did you solve this? I hope
this is a very valid challenge. I think a lot of us have faced this at some point or the other. Right. Because at the end of the day, people want very directed answers, right? I think that's the problem. People don't want to go through like a big document. They want very directed answers to their questions. And this is where how you write a PRD adds a lot of value, which is, can you structure it in a way where they can go find the answer to their question? And which is why choosing the PRD format becomes very important, which is, let's say an engineer wants to answer questions around, okay, what should happen when user clicks on this? Those are sort of questions, let's say the user has. Can your PRD format have a section which is basic just scenarios? Like just have a section called scenarios where you're describing all these scenarios. Or there might be flow-based question, which is like, okay, if user does this and this, what should happen? Can you put flowcharts into your PRD where like, so you want to make sure your PRD becomes the PRD format, and the way you structure the document becomes easier for them to consume than talking to you. It's a little challenge. It'll be a lot of trial and error, but the answer to that is different for different companies. Basically, you want to write the document in a way where people can find answers themselves and not rely on you. Make it more consumable, right? And in fact, this is actually just good advice for writing and not just PRDs, which is always ask like, who are you writing this document for, and how will they get value out of it? Versus like just writing it based on some fixed structure or something that's beneficial to you. Think about how will an engineer get benefit out of this? What will he look at? And structure your document around that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this does make sense. Yeah, thank you so much.
It's going to be a lot of trial and error. Like it's not like I won't say it's easy to find, but with trial and error, I think within a few months you'll find something that really works.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's great.
So Akshay, there's one more question by Deepak. He says, and Deepak, I'll just unmute you and you can ask your question. Just give me a second. Okay, I'm not able to find him. Anyway, so let's say, so he's saying my company wants to build an app in healthcare sector, right? Okay. So there will be a master PRD at platform levels, and I'll be creating PRDs for all product lines of the platform. So how to go about it if he wants to build an app in the healthcare sector? So will there be a master PRD at a platform level?
That's one way to do it. You can have a master PRD where you explain why you want to do the healthcare app, right? Like what is the objective of doing the healthcare app? What problems will it solve? I'm just going to take a weird example and just say, let's say your healthcare app helps hospitals order oxygen on time, which is something that's needed right now. Let's say that's your app. So you put that as your problem statement saying, okay, hospitals are not able to find oxygen at time. We're going to build an app which helps them like order that in real time. That becomes your master PRD. And now when you go into solution alignment, then you're like, hey, I need these different tools to work for it. So then you link into different PRDs saying, okay, on our backend team, like machine learning team or something, there's a separate problem statement for them. Like you take the master problem statement flesh that out, and inside the solutions, then you flesh it out into smaller problem statements. And then there's sub PRDs for all of that. At least that's how we've done it at Haptik. Different companies might do it differently, but this is something that I've seen really work, which is you have your master problem statement, then you break it down into smaller problem statements based on different tools. And then each of them has their own separate PRDs, which ties into the original one.
Okay. There's one more question by Ravi. Ravi, you just want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, I mean, not a question. I was just replying to someone mentioning that this can be gathered in the requirements part. So I was just meaning to say that we shouldn't avoid talking to people who might be using our platform, who might not be in the tech team or the marketing team. There could be some different community who are using our platform and providing service.
Correct. Got it. So usually what happens is, so that's why you would need a representative for that user. Maybe like I'll give you again example from my own experience. The retention team, or let's say the acquisition team, was a representative of the user, right? And they would give their requirement based on how they are perceiving data, or by user interviews, or by focus group study, whatever they would gather from the users, right? So there's an interesting anecdote, and not very related to this, but Amazon used to have, or I'm not sure if they still do, they have a empty chair, which they say that this represents the customer, and as a principle they have it in their meetings. But anyway, Akshay, what do you?
No, I think that makes sense. Like when you're defining problems, you definitely want to talk to representatives and stakeholders to get those problems.
Correct.
So we'll go ahead. No?
Yeah, sure.
We spend enough time on that, and there's a lot of content to cover yet. So now that we've defined, like now let's say this is one recommended format. I'll just walk you through the entire format. You can follow it to its entirety or change it based on your company, but I'll just go through the format. So the first section of the PRD, and I think I really like the structure because it forces you to think problem and solution separately. And that's something at least I used to struggle initially as a PM, which is it's easy to skip to a solution saying, okay, I'll just build this. It's hard to really think about why are we doing it and is it really needed? And that's what I think separates great PMs from others, which is, can you really explain why you're doing it? And this section is critical because you don't even get into the solution, just talking about problems. So the problem alignment section of the PRD, I'll show you how it looks like as well in a sample. But this section, this is the primary responsibility of the product manager, right? Like nobody else is responsible for this. As a product manager, it is your responsibility to make sure there's problem alignment inside the company. And that's the reason it's called problem alignment, which is everybody should know why we're doing it. Like everybody in the company should know why you're building a feature. Like because you're putting a lot of engineering resources on it, you're spending a lot of time. There should be crystal clear clarity on why it is being done. And that's the biggest job of a product manager, right? In fact, which is why I believe that this is the most important section of the PRD. Like if you screw this up, like everything gets screwed up. If you define the problem wrong, your solution is going to be wrong. Doesn't really matter when you launch it, and this obviously not going to be success. So this is the most important part of the PRD, and this is where at least I spend a lot of time. And as I mentioned, like if you ask me, or like if don't ask me, like even like if you go through industry veterans like Marty Kagan and all these people, the biggest thing that they'll say is the primary responsibility of a PM is to define the why, which is why are we doing this? Why are we adding this feature? Why are we adding this screen? Why does this button need to be here? Like that's the number one thing that you have to do as a PM, which is answer the why. And how well you do it essentially is a metric of how good a PM you are. Like at least that's how I look at it. If you can define why at a very deep level, then that's what makes you a great PM at the end of the day. So having said that, let's just look at what this format looks like and how this section looks like. So within your document, you'll have a problem alignment section, which is probably like you'll put a heading called problem alignment. And first you'll have a problem section where you just describe the problem you're trying to solve. So within this, like I wanted to use a real PRD but because of like privacy and stuff, I can't really share my company's PRDs here. But in the problem statement, you essentially define what is the problem you're trying to solve. Let's just take example of the healthcare app that you're trying to build, right? Like the problem could be hospitals are unable to find oxygen in time. Like that's the problem statement. You define that. You define why is it important to our users and our business. It's important to our users because they want to go to a hospital and they want to find oxygen. And it's important for the business because like essentially like if your hospital is incapable, then people will go to another hospital, right? That's important for their business. It's important for your business because let's just say you are the ones who are manufacturing and selling the oxygen. It's important that you're able to serve your customers well. So in the first section, you define the problem in itself and make sure you detailed enough so that anybody who reads that understands what you're trying to do. If relevant, if you think there's confusion, you can also add things like, okay, but we will not solve for this. For example, you can say, like in this section, you can say, okay, we're solving for oxygen, but we are not solving for beds. Like this solution will not solve for availability of beds or anything. So you can bring that clarity as well because you don't want people to be confused at the end of the day. And this happens a lot because then engineering will be like, oh, what about this? What about this? So you have to clearly define, okay, this is the problem we're solving. This is the problem we are not solving. And then provide a high level approach on how you think this problem should be solved. Don't go deep into the solution. Just put out something like, okay, we'll build an e-commerce site. We'll build a two-sided market, just at a high level, as if you're explaining it to somebody like in a lobby or on an escalator, right? Like it's like your escalator pitch. Essentially, you're trying to define what approach you will take. And you're not really going into the solution or the design of it. Like you shouldn't say, I'll put a form here that people will fill. Just say, okay, there'll be a website where people can go and find it or something. So put a high level approach on how you're looking to solve the problem. And finally, the most important section is goals and success. Let's just say this problem is solved. What does success look like? And it's very important to have this because if you're not measuring it, then like, how do you even know if it worked out? Like you need to really define, if I solve it, like what does solving this problem even mean? I hope that makes sense because for every problem you need to define what metrics you're intending to move. Like, will this increase revenue? Will this increase usage? Will this make our user experience better? Like, what is the goal? What does success look like? And that's something you put in this section. This is overall the problem alignment section. A few tips on writing good problem alignment. How do you get better at writing problem alignment? The first thing I'll say is consistently ask the why. Like, in fact, I think a lot of you might have read about it. It's called the 5 whys, which is you keep asking why until you get to the root of the problem. So do the same thing, right? Try to keep asking why until you get to a point where it is one of the North Star metrics or like one of the goals for the entire company. And how do you know if it's a goal for the entire company? In 95% of the cases, right? It will be one of these three. It will either be increase revenue, or it will be get more users, or it will be reduce churn. And by reduce churn, I mean people who are like dropping off and then like, let's say they're uninstalling the app, right? So more of like in most cases, it will be one of these three. And you want to make sure you're asking the why until you get to one of these answers. Like if you're building a feature, ask why am I building this feature? It will do this. Okay, why should we do that? And keep asking that question until you get to an answer like, okay, if we do this, it will increase revenue. If we do this, it will get us more users. If we do this, it will reduce churn. And that is when you can be clear that you actually understand the problem. Don't keep the problem statement too abstract. Don't say things like, we'll make the experience better. Like, that's okay. Everybody will agree that making experience is better, but that's not a problem statement, right? Make your problem statement very defined. Things like people are not able to find the requirement on the website, make the experience better. Finally, list down all the goals you intend to achieve. Like, what are like even like sometimes you're like, hey, there's no way I can measure this metric. There's no way I can measure this. But even then, list it down. List down all the things that you believe this problem should solve. Like, what does success look like? Is make sure you define all of that in the right way. So that is problem alignment. I'll take a pause here because it's pretty important. Any questions?
Guys, please feel free to ask any questions you have. Please raise your hand and I'll just unmute you so you can ask your question.
And I know it seems like a lot of work. It's like, hey, why can't I just like say add a form and be done with it? It's an easy way out, and like it's very tempting to do that, but on the long term, making sure you define your problems correctly will make you a better PM. Ankit, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
yep. So we have Sriram who wants to ask a question. Just give me a second. Sriram, unmuted you.
Perfect. Hey, hi. Hope you're well. I just have one question. In one of the companies that I worked previously, the CEO emphasized on adding the competition analysis, the competitor analysis as well in the PRDs that we write.
yeah.
So what's your take on it?
My personal take on it is don't care about the competition, care about your user and care about the problem, right? Like what is the problem your user is facing and how you're going to solve it. Competition could be doing it well, could be not doing it well. You can look at it for reference, but at least my belief is that you shouldn't care more about the user than your competition. Like, especially if you're in the startup world, which is the world I come from.
Yeah.
Competition will never kill you. Like, I think the number of startups that die because of competition is like negligible. What will kill you is users not wanting your product.
I do have a follow-up question to that. As in, I totally second you on your thought about, like not taking too much into consideration what the competition is doing. But then we'll be doing our basic research about what they did and how that panned out, right? So should we add that? I mean, like to make sure that. So basically, let's say that I am a PM of a company right now, and I might leave the company at a certain point of time, or there might be somebody who is replacing me. So the research that has gone into making sure, behind a certain decision also needs to be recorded, right? So is the PRD the place where we record that as well? So I'll try to rephrase my question that way.
Good question. I think there are some cases where you might put it, but it should still not go into the problem alignment section of it. When you're going into a solution, or like let's say you're going even in problem, let's say you're talking about high level approach. Here, maybe you can mention saying, okay, across the industry, this is how we see people approaching this problem, and we see it working. So which is why we'll take the same approach. Or you can be like, across the industry, companies do not take this approach, they're taking something else, but I don't believe it will work for so and so reasons. Which is why we're taking a different approach.
Okay, that answers my question.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So Akshay had a question. Akshay, go ahead.
Hi, Akshay. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm actually a starter in terms of trying to learn about products, and I wanted to know if adding value propositions in these segments would be useful. How would it impact the detailness of a PRD?
Can you elaborate on what you mean by value proposition?
So how would this help the consumer, in clearly communicating the goals of why this feature is being worked on?
No, actually it's critical that you add that, right? That goes into the goals section, which is like, goal is essentially what is the value the end user will eventually get out of this, right? Like if I solve this, if I solve this problem, what is the value that my user or my business will get? And that's essentially your goals and success section. In fact, it's very critical that you put that.
Do we have any business purviews involved in this particular area? Like how much revenue would this generate? Something like that?
You could add both. So again, like there'll be some features you build for end users, and even those cases you can tie it back to business value, which is like, let's say you're making sure users stick around for a longer time, right? Like for example, you want to increase your funnel throughput. Something you can say, this feature will make the user experience better, which will eventually lead to reduced churn in my platform. Like a lot of people will, like uninstall rates will go from 25% to let's say 20%.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yep. Let's go ahead, Akshay.
So the next section is a solution section. This is where you define, like now that you have, hopefully you have crystal clear clarity on what the problem you're trying to solve, what are the goals and what are the values, what are the value propositions there. The next thing you have to answer is, okay, how will you solve them? And this is where you get into the details of it, which is, okay, this is how we'll design it. This is how the technical architecture will look like. This is how we'll solve all of it. And this is very important for the engineering and design teams. This section is primarily built for them so that they can refer to this while developing the product. Controversial point of view from me, but and some companies follow it, some companies don't. I believe that a PM should take a step back when filling out this section. and leverage his engineering and design teams to come up with a solution. But in some companies, PMs come up with a solution as well. But primarily, I believe that the best people to come up with a solution are your design and engineering team. So you should leverage them, you should talk to them, ask them, okay, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. How do you think we should solve it? Because you might be surprised. Your engineering team might have a very good solution for it. Your design team might have a new design or a different UX flow that they have. And you should leverage their knowledge in this section and make sure you bring the best out of them as well. But again, like in the last section, I said great PMs define the why very well. Another attribute to great PMs is they're able to collaborate with different stakeholders very well, right? Which is you don't want to be a dictator defining everything on the PRD. Get everybody's inputs, take inputs from everybody, take inputs from your engineering team, take input from your design team. In fact, I would say take inputs from your marketing and sales team as well, because they're the ones directly talking to the customers at the end of the day. Get their inputs in, talk to stakeholders, and then leverage all of these to come up with a solution, and don't start with the solution yourself. Having said that, this is what the section looks like. Solution element, you define your key features. You can make this bullet points or user stories or whatever you follow at your company, right? If you follow Jira and user stories, you could just key features, you could just list down your Jira saying, okay, these are key things we'll do. And then you define your key flows, which is you put your like Figma designs or Marvel designs or whatever they are into the solution alignment. The idea is engineer, if he's coming in at a later point, they can just look at the solution alignment and they know exactly, okay, these are the things we need to do to make this feature work. And like, let's say there's a lot of scenario-based questions that you get or a lot of flow-based questions. You can add those things. Like you can make a table saying scenarios and just list down, okay, if this happens, then our product should do this. If this happens, our product should do this. Define all of those things which you feel are valuable to your engineering team and put that into this section. And this becomes like a blueprint that they use to solve the problem. Some tips on, right, like be succeeding at this section and making sure people get value is try to use bullet points and highlight key sections within your thing. So, because at least in my opinion, like you might disagree with this, like engineers want to get a quick glimpse and get done with it. They don't want to read like 10-page documents. So make sure you highlight everything in bullet points. You highlight important aspects, you put bullet points so everybody is on the same page there. And one thing I've realized is like designs tend to change as you're building the product because you learn new things. So avoid putting screenshots of designs and rather try to embed the design itself. So it's a live version of what you're building. Figma, Marvel, whatever you use at your company, try to see if you can embed it into the document itself. Some tools will allow you, some tools will not. Some tools that I know that allow such embedding that you can use are Notion and Coda, but don't use screenshots. Screenshots is a bad idea because they quickly get outdated the moment your design changes, or you'll have to keep updating screenshots in your PRDs. Any questions in the solutions aspect of it?
Guys, please feel free to type in any questions you have.
Yeah. Akshay, I got a small doubt here. So when do you usually begin your PRD? Because right now you just said embedding with interest screenshots, you use tools to directly put down the live development, but I usually write it before the development phase, at least after the envision prototypes or some live prototypes. So
Yeah.
when do you usually suggest this PRDs?
So the way I'll tell you my workflow, right? I'll first define my problems. I'll start writing my PRD before the feature is built. I'll define the problem. Then I'll take it to my engineering team and design team and be like, okay, guys, we need to come up with a solution for this. Then we have some sort of, we have few meetings and we decide the solution and we leave the design section empty, saying, okay, design is like in progress. So on the PRD itself, I'll say design to be done. And then once the design is ready, I'll add the design link here itself. So a PRD doesn't have to be set in stone. Like it's an evolving document, right? Like you first write your problem, then you discuss it, then you add your solution, then you add your design.
Yeah. So do you use this for sign off any kind of, sign off with the stakeholders or something? Do you use these documents for something that sort?
Correct. We do use it for sign off. I'll get to it when I get to launch readiness, but every section of this has to be signed off by the stakeholders. In my case, it's my manager. But like we definitely, and I would highly recommend that you use PRDs to sign off, right? And you should
Yeah,
sign
not
off on that.
internally. I mean with the clients. Because if we keep the design section as to be done or TBD, something that sort, when are we expecting it to get a sign off and then begin the development?
So you can change that, right? Like you can get an internal sign off on your problem from, like, let's say the key manager, like your manager or like whoever is responsible for that business within the company. At least to make sure that you're solving the right problem, because like people shouldn't come at a later point and be like, hey, this is not really a problem worth solving. So you get sign off on that. And like, I agree, like you can't go to the clients with a problem saying, hey, is this a problem for you? Once your designs are ready, you can take the PRD to them and then get a design. Like this, you can have different sign-offs at different stages of the document.
Okay.
Get sign off from client. So we have a checklist.
Akshay, we lost
then
you.
We'll go ahead.
We lost you for like 30 seconds. So.
No, so I was just saying we should, like, there can be different sign-offs at different stages of the document. Like you can have one sign-off on problem state, like once you define the problem statement, then another sign-off once you define your user stories, then another sign-off once you have design ready. And you can decide who the stakeholders are at each stage of this. And we actually put this directly into our checklist for PRDs. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about launch checklist.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. So let's go ahead.
Yes.
Cool. So finally, the last section of this is now we assume that the problem and solution are fleshed out. The last section is the launch readiness, which is how will we launch this feature and how will we take this to market. So what you want to do here is you want to break the feature down into a set of milestones. Very important, like this is more of a tip than a thing, but generally, like, don't try to keep a feature too big, saying, okay, this will take 4 months to build. Try to always break it down into smaller milestones, which is what is the smallest thing I can ship and start getting feedback. And always question your feature on that, right? Like, what is the one part of this which I can like quickly ship independently and still see value and get feedback? Try to break it down into milestones. And then for each milestone, you can have a checklist saying, I need to get approval from these people. I need to get these marketing material ready. I need to get this ready. You need to have a communication ready, all of that. So for each of those milestones, you set your checklists. This include checklists across the team, right? Like one of the checklist item will be have the code deployed on production. That's one of the checklist item. Like if you need to expand your infrastructure because you expect a lot more users, getting more infrastructure is one of the checklist items. Like getting bigger servers is one of the checklist items. So make sure your checklist is very detailed that way. And like work with your marketing engineering teams to come up with these timelines, right? Like let's say one of the checklist items is get new servers, talk to the engineering team, ask them, okay, how long do you think that will take? Push them on it a little, but then try to get them to commit to timelines and then put those into the checklist, because it brings more clarity across the team. Everybody knows what needs to be done and also potentially by what time it needs to be done. So this is what this section typically looks like. You have your key milestones, which is, let's say my first release is going to be on May 4th, and I'm going to release it to internal employees only. And then you describe whatever you want to do. Like I want to test this internally before. Then my second is there's going to be beta release around May 11th, where I'll release it to 100 customers. And then on May 19th, I do a full launch. So break it down into milestones, make sure like you're getting something out and you're getting feedback early enough. So after that, you also have a checklist, which is you say, okay, when this feature goes out, I need to make sure my support teams are ready to handle this. So you put all those things, right? Like, is my support team ready to take questions to this answer? Is my marketing team ready with the material? Like, do we need to do, like, let's say a marketing campaign for this feature? Are they aware of it? By when can they get their material ready? Have all of that fleshed out in the launch checklist. Some tips here is like when you define the checklist, actually tag people on it. So when you're putting support checklist item saying supporting needs to be ready with this, tag your head of support. Tell him, hey, we're building this feature. you can see the problem you're solving, you can see the solution we're solving. By when can you think support team can get ready with it, and get them to commit to a timeline? Because I'll tell you, this happens a lot when like you'll have built a feature, you'll spend 4 months building that feature, and then once you're about to launch, you'll be like, the support team will be like, hey, we didn't know this feature was going to be there. We need to first learn about this. You need to help us answer these questions. And then you'll find a lot of these blockers come in at a later point. You wanna be ready for them beforehand. Like you want to make sure everybody is aligned on this from day one, which is like, let's say you're starting building a feature today, you go to your support team and tell them, see, sometime in May, I'm going to release this feature. What will it take the support team to be ready? By when do you think support team can be ready? So even it's not a surprise or a shock for them. They are also ready that by May, I'm going to get this. And I need to be ready. So make sure your checklist is define that very well. And the reason to do this is like remember that a PM's job is not to ship features, right? Like your job is not to ship features and be done with that. Your job is to drive business impact. So in fact, I would say most of your job starts after your feature is released, which is support able to answer these questions? Are your users actually getting value? Does the metrics make sense? And again, you go back to the goals that you define in problem statement, which is, let's say you said this will increase revenue by 20%. Is it actually increasing revenue by 20%? What is happening? So make sure your checklist accounts for all of that. Let's say you said your goal was increasing revenue, but you have no way to measure revenue. So one of your checklist items should be set a weekly meeting with the head of finance so that I can get data on this, and talk to them early on in the process, saying, hey, we're building this feature, we need to get data on what revenue we're making. By when can you make that happen? Try to iron out the problems before you get them, and that way you can ensure a smoother go to market. Any questions? And this is what makes a great PRD, by the way. If you've fleshed all of this, it's a lot of work. It'll take a lot of time to flesh out a good PRD, but trust me, at the end of the day, it's worth it.
So Akshay, I was recently working on an Australian metro project. So, okay. In this case, how do you want us as a BA or PM to look as a business impact? Like, I understand there are certain products like say Google Pay or Phone Pay, which we can happily understand, what kind of business impact or, good people impact that we can try bringing into public or something. But there would be projects like, this metro, or which will be very like B2B, not B2C. And how should our view or, what do you say? How should we kind of look at these projects as?
You basically keep asking why you're doing it and for whom, right? Like, let's say you're building it for the Australian metro. So you ask yourself, okay, why are we doing this? I'm just going to make a few assumptions here. Let's say you're building some software for their internal teams, right? Then you ask, okay, why am I building this for their internal teams? Maybe it's because you want to help them communicate better within their teams itself. Okay, then you ask, okay, why should they communicate better within themselves? Then you say, because if there's no communications, there's a lot of lack of things, the projects slow down internally. So you want to make sure the projects don't slow down. So then you ask, okay, why should the projects not slow down? Then you say, okay, if the projects don't slow down, if the projects slow down, there's loss of revenue for the metro company. And then you're like, okay, so your goal is to make sure this revenue is not lost for the metro company. And then you work backwards from there. Okay. Getting the data might be a little tricky sometimes, but you can keep it informal as well, which is you can talk to the clients and tell them, okay, do you think this is working out? Are the number of communication gaps breaking down? Are the number of communication gaps reducing? Are you able to communicate effectively? So you can build high level metrics to understand it, but essentially keep asking why until you get to the root of the problem. And there's a reason, there'll always be a reason, right? Because at the end of the day, they're paying money for this, and they'll not pay money for something which is not solving the problem for them.
Yeah, makes sense.
As we have time for another 2 or 3 questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask the question. Okay. We'll just wait for a minute and then I think we'll be good. Akshay? Just give me a second. So Sajmal Yusuf has wants to ask one question. Hey, I have unmuted you. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey Akshay. So my question was around which is there a part that would cover the who part of feature? Who is the feature for or a user persona? Would that come in this topic?
Yeah, great question actually. So that actually goes into the problem statement, right? So when you're defining why is it important to our users, you'll have to define who is your user. The reason I didn't put it is like the assumption is like if you're building it for let's say Google Pay, let's say there's already clear understanding of who your users are. But if there's not, then you should definitely add it into problem alignment. Just this is the user we're solving for, and this is what we're solving for them. But again, that depends. Like if you feel that it requires that, in some cases the products, everybody in the team knows who the users are. In such cases, you don't have to. But if it's different or if it's new, you can add that.
So Akshay, Shriram says it was a great session and thanks a million to Akshay for patiently answering every question.
No, thanks guys. Thanks for taking time on a weekend. And hopefully this was valuable and now you can write better PRDs and also like hopefully you understood different aspects of the PM's job.
Thank you so much everyone for taking the time out on a Saturday evening. Thanks a lot Akshay for taking the time out and walking us through what are the best practices for writing PRDs. Right, guys, we'll keep having webinars weekly or bi-weekly. Please follow us on LinkedIn and have a great weekend ahead. Please stay safe. Thank you so much guys. Bye.
Thanks guys.